Today at Google, we're excited to welcome Mr. Noam Cohen. Mr. Cohen is a former technology columnist at the New York Times, where beginning in 2007, he wrote the Bit by Bit column, which covered the impact of the internet on society. He recently left the Times in order to write his first book, which he is here today to discuss. It's titled The Know-It-Alls: The Rise of Silicon Valley as a Political Powerhouse and Social Wrecking Ball. The book is an incisive biography of some of Silicon Valley's most venerated leaders. It offers a critique of the current state of the internet and explores the implications of radical individualism on democratic ideals and American life. Please join me in welcoming to Google, Mr. Noam Cohen.
Thank you. Thanks. Nice to be here. And I felt it was a little bit like going to the belly of the beast, but it's been very welcoming in here, nice and warm in the belly. And no, I'm glad to be here. And yeah, I look
We're excited to have you.
Sure, yeah. Yes.
So I'd love to start at the beginning. Where did the idea for the book come from?
Right. So as you mentioned, I was a tech writer at the Times for a lot of years. I would write in the business section, but I often would not write about businesses. I'd write a lot about Wikipedia. I'd write about free software. I was really intrigued by how the internet and the web was changing society, and a little less about the business implications of it. And it was always kind of curious. I was in the business section, but I just didn't really. I was more interested in. It didn't really focus on companies and such like that. But over time, I couldn't keep my head buried to see that how these great innovations were becoming part of businesses. And I wanted to sort of see how we got to our current situation, a situation where, so much of our interaction with the internet is through big companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook. And I really felt there was a corrosion coming from that. Some of the values that were being taught through these companies and through the internet were becoming quite libertarian and quite a threat to like the social fabric and what I would call like libertarian ideas. And of course, the meddling in the 2016 election became this real watershed. So I had these concerns, but it kind of it made things much more clear why the stakes were very high. That our democracy could be at stake, rather than kind of being a critic of Silicon Valley, being like, is Google making you dumb, or do young people care about privacy? The question was like, are these companies kind of compatible with democracy? So that gave my book a lot of urgency, and obviously I worked on it before that, and I was trying to kind of look at these kind of questions, and what I kind of came up with, like an operating idea of the book, is that there are these two forces that account for what's going on. One force is the history of computer science. Like you said, I went really deep dive looking at how computer science got developed, and also Stanford. And so until I had done the book, I hadn't realized how important AI was to the history of computer science. Like, I guess maybe that's well known. I didn't realize that is what, I focused one chapter about John McCarthy, who was this really significant figure, particularly in Google. I would think he'd be very venerated, like you're saying. I know that early on he was in the same building with Sergey Brin and Larry Page when they were grad students at Stanford, and he came early on to Google to visit the campus. And I was really struck that even the Google search engine early on used McCarthy's website. He had this early website at Stanford, and they used that as a way of proving that personalized search would be much better. They took all the knowledge you get from McCarthy's website, and they plugged it into their PageRank, and it produced some much better results. So this McCarthy is such a fascinating figure, and he's sort of not been written about that much. He becomes like a surrogate for computer science for me. That he was born to communist parents. He was a math genius, and over time he was fascinated with artificial intelligence and wanted to create a thinking being. And so this early pioneer of computer science who created the LISP program, he was motivated by making a thinking being. And that's kind of what's driven computer science history, I found. So I was looking at that. So what does it mean? McCarthy became a mentor to the hackers. And it means that idea of seeing a machine as a person and a person as a machine, and this idea that computers can really save the world was really important to McCarthy. And it kind of, that thread is what I kind of, borrowing from Stephen Levy, is what I call like the hacker ethic, like this idea that, being highly individualistic, which you see on the Google campus, people are free to do what they want, really challenging authority, and also kind of not caring, valuing intelligence very highly, and not kind of caring about diversity of women or minorities. It's sort of this idea that merit and intelligence is what gets you where you are. So that was like one thread, was this history of computer science. I went like deep into that. and McCarthy. The second thread was Stanford. I kind of learned how Stanford became so crucial to the idea of entrepreneurship and the idea that you should take innovations that come, research from your alumni, your students and your faculty, and put them to the market. And that kind of began with this fellow named, who has a chapter in the book, Lewis Terman, who he brought Hewlett and Packard together, these two graduate students of his in the 30s. He said, you two should go into business together. He gave them some money to start up. He gave them their first contract with Walt Disney back in the 30s. And he sort of preached this idea that research should have a practical, business-related use. And that he thought would help Stanford rise up in stature. When he took over as provost in the 50s, Stanford was considered this kind of middling school for like kind of well-off people in Los Angeles, like a quote I saw. And by the time he left, Stanford was going way up. And of course, we now today see how many companies have come out of Stanford. And that money finds its way back to Stanford. And Stanford is this rich, booming, highly prestigious school. So those two threads, kind of the hacker ethic and the entrepreneurism, is kind of where I see how we got to where we are today. So that's what I felt like I got an answer,
right.
to my question. Yeah.
So it sort of seems like in the book you trace a long period of time, starting with McCarthy, and it was at the 50s.
Yeah, he was this figure, right? So he is known for being kind of the mentor, Uncle John, they called him at MIT, the mentor to the hackers in the 50s at MIT. He taught the first sort of computer science class for freshmen in the 50s. And I think what was really vital about McCarthy too, which I talk about in the book, is that this idea he came up with time sharing, which was that prior to time sharing, the computers were these, mainframes that you had to approach like as a priestly class. You had to kind of go to an operator and give them questions, and they would come back like Delphic answers. And instead, he said, no, we should have terminals hooked up to this one mainframe so lots of individuals can interact with the computer directly. And I think for him, that was key to AI, right? This idea that like, if you're gonna make a thinking machine, they should interact with as many people as possible and sort of learn from people and sort of judge them on how they interact with people. So he became a real force for making computers much more accessible, which again, we're living with today, this idea that computers aren't an oracle, they're like a personal thing. You really, the cloud, I think, even comes from that idea.
So John McCarthy, that was sort of in the first generation of hackers, had the hacker ethic. And then later on, this sort of entrepreneur, Frederick Terman at Stanford, sort of brought this other side of what you call the know-it-all, sort of the business-minded application side. How would you distinguish, say, McCarthy in the first generation of hackers' motivations and the way that they approached computing and what they wanted computers to do for society? How would you distinguish that with what maybe entrepreneurs in technology are doing today?
I was really struck that how idealistic McCarthy was. Like McCarthy never went into business. And he, this idea of the singularity, right? This idea that computers are gonna get smarter than us, we people, and then eventually smarter computers are gonna make even smarter computers, and then it's like off to the races. So he, in '68, he gave a lecture at Stanford that raised that exact point. And but rather than fearing this would mean that computers are gonna take over the world and they'll be our overlords, he said, when that happens, the first thing we do is we ask the question, hey computer, we made you, you're smarter than us, what should we do now? Like he believed intelligence was a good thing. Like he didn't fear it he thought like I assume he thought having a thinking computer would like explain the cosmos. Like we have microscope, we have telescopes, we're trying to understand what we're doing here. A smarter computer is going to really get to an answer. What is this? Like, what is the universe? And so that idealism and that almost impractical, nature, I think was true of that era of AI researchers. And you read about the Stanford lab, because McCarthy made this transition. He went from MIT, he was sort of frustrated by the weather, frustrated by other things, and he moved to Stanford in '62 and recreated the MIT lab at Stanford. And it became this real hothouse of just really kind of innovative, but also more just like free spirits. And there was actually Russell Brand, the famous sort of founder of the Whole Earth catalog, wrote this profile of the Stanford AI lab in the '60s, and it was when they were making the first video game, Space War. It just was a very loosey-goosey and not nearly as efficiency-driven kind of world. Now, cut to today, I think partly it's out of the failure of AI, is how I see things, that AI didn't succeed in creating this cosmos understanding, thinking being. Rather, it created something that kind of imitates a person. And That quality has been very useful for businesses because these algorithms aren't actually answering the big questions. They aren't approaching what we consider special about human intelligence. They're just sort of doing things much more efficiently. And so that lack of this success has actually led to these businesses having a great, making great hay of that development. I'll put it this way, it was interesting to watch, you talk about looking at the history of this. The history of like chess computers itself is just a fascinating thing, right? When McCarthy created one of the first chess programs, it was really as an undergraduate, did all the work, right? He was the professor. It was amazing to think that like chess, this intellectual activity that like only people who smoke pipes and were reading great books, and that a computer could be better than a human. It's amazing. So it won this first match, and in fact, there was a famous critic of AI, right? This guy Hubert Dreyfus, who was at Berkeley, right? A philosophy professor who kind of questioned the whole idea of AI, and he said, "And what is AI doing anyway? Can't even beat a 12-year-old in chess." So they became obsessed with beating Hubert Dreyfus at chess, which they did in 1966. There was a big match because he didn't back out of it, and they beat Hubert Dreyfus at chess, and the New Yorker wrote about it as a big event. But so you'd think that was a huge accomplishment, and of course now chess computers are better than any human. But of course McCarthy realized that what was it succeeding at? It wasn't thinking better. It was just calculating so much faster. And so in that sense, that speaks to exactly what we're at. Like we have made a computer, I don't know, would have dreamed that a computer could have been better than any chess master. It was a real ambitious thing to think about. Now that's easily done, but it doesn't have any real payoff in his sense. So I think today people are more focused on making a great chess computer, and that's an awesome thing. And McCarthy would have been like, in fact, like that's not anything. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference, I'd say, the idealism and the ambition, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's the market influence that maybe shifted the focus?
Well, I don't know. I think maybe McCarthy would have just like not done anything with it because if it didn't answer his question, he would have moved on. I think the markets at least show there's a real utility to it, like a real utility to like these algorithms that have a real power. It wasn't what he was interested in. I'll tell like one other, like I'm almost thinking about like the next thing I want to write about, and I mentioned a bit in this op-ed I wrote in the Times about ELIZA. Like to me, ELIZA, this program, is really interesting to me about all these questions because, right, ELIZA was written by this MIT professor named Joseph Weizenbaum, who was a bit of a rival of McCarthy's, and it was a chatbot and really crude. He wrote it so quickly, and it just imitated a therapist, right? So it would just sort of spit back what you would say to it. It would say like, you would say, "Oh, I'm really nervous to be here. Why are you nervous?" "Well, my family doesn't like to talk a lot." "Does your family bother you?" I would just ask very open-ended questions and with no knowledge, using keywords, and would kind of repeat it back to you. Mm-hmm. So Weizenbaum made this program and was shocked to realize that like his own secretary was interacting with it, and he's looking over her shoulder, and she's like, "Could you give me some privacy, please?" And he's like, "What? You're just talking to like a bot I made in like one day." And he realized that there was a huge power to these computers, and a huge ability of people to trust them and to be manipulated, and he wasn't interested in that. So I think the same thing, that McCarthy just wouldn't have been interested in using computers to like imitate people, to manipulate them, or to make, that wasn't what he was doing. I don't think it's a market force thing. I think market people saw that's a great tool.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is you label something a libertarian in the book? What is that? How is that characteristic
right.
of a lot of
I guess I should focus on, like, the point I'm trying to say is that the know-it-alls are kind of promoting a libertarian ideology, a very hyper-individualistic ideology. And I think it comes from a variety of reasons. Like the hacker ethic is part of that, like of just the good part of like saying, leave me alone, fly my own freak flag. And so it's part of that, but also it's just the breaking down of institutions is also part of it, and like kind of people being more on their own. So to me, the libertarian is kind of people who focus on who don't see the costs of libertarianism, but see the good side, which is that the freedom people have. And so people, like I was telling you maybe beforehand, like Elon Musk is maybe an example of this, or Jeff Bezos I think is another, because he's a big supporter of like libertarian magazine Reason, and he identifies, I think, in a lot of ways libertarianism, but like also I think sees himself as a little bit liberal. And it's this idea that like, I see I take ideas from both sides, or I see the libertarianism allowing you to like have gay marriage and have freedom to smoke whatever you want, and then sort of not seeing the role of government, seeing government as a bad thing. So saying government is actually hurting people, it's like limiting people, and there's no freedom to do your own car, or the free speech limits. So rather than seeing free speech limits as about protecting, people who are weak, minorities and women, you can see free speech protections as like clamping down on an individual. I can't say what I want. So you can kind of frame it like a liberal thing. I think that's what I'm kind of saying. The libertarians, they're not really, they're trying to put a much more positive spin on libertarianism, maybe not like this kind of feudalism of libertarianism, which is that we're all in a battle for resources and like let the strongest one win. Like that's bad PR. I think it's a kind of a more humane face for libertarianism. I think that's kind of what is coming out of Silicon Valley. It's not this harsh, other than maybe Peter Thiel or something, it's not a harsh libertarian view. It's just more soft, we want everyone to excel, and that's what it's about. It's about individualism. So yeah, I think that's a key issue. Yeah.
And so in the book, you critique the sort of the internet that's evolved out of this sort of libertarian ethic. It's sort of commercialized and centralized. And you say in place of that, we should be focusing more on local institutions, local newspapers, local trade unions. What was the sort of inspiration for that in your mind?
Right.
Or who were your influences that may have shaped your thinking?
I guess I was saying an important thinker, a philosopher named Muller Oken, who wrote a book it's called like Justice, Family, and it's a critique of libertarianism from a feminist perspective, and it really spoke to me because basically what she was saying is that libertarianism has to devalue women. It's not a coincidence that there aren't tech sisters. Like tech bros are a thing because libertarianism is this idea that you kind of arrive at your station in life on your own work and worth. And it kind of assumes that we all like land as fully formed adults, and then we kind of deal with how we're going to allocate resources in our society. And she was pointing out that, now obviously today we have more equal share over raising kids, but fundamentally, young adults arrive there through women. And it's like, she was making a kind of argument, reductio ad absurdum argument of saying that like, if the extreme libertarians say whatever you produce is your own, she was saying, well then if women produce children, do they own them? I mean, is that like, it's just, she was trying to cut through all of the fallacy that we're just individuals striving together, that you're a product of a family, and then a family is part of a neighborhood is part of a society. And so I think that was really influential to me to see that in some ways, the kind of male culture of Silicon Valley and the libertarian culture of Silicon Valley were related, that it's kind of wishing away how we got here and kind of just wanting to be, it's not very adolescent, I would say, I say that in good and bad ways, adolescent instinct to be, I'm here, I want to make my mark on the world, who cares how, daddy and mommy go away, I'm in charge now. It's like, but it's not really, it's not true to the society. I think that's one of the themes I got to in the book was about kind of the fantasy of the internet, that basically the internet is imagining a world free from a lot of the pull of history and of racism, misogyny. And I looked at this, this famous document, this John Perry Barlow Declaration of Cyberspace Independence, which he wrote in the 1990s. He's a founder of EFF, this very important, digital rights movement. He was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and he basically just says we're making a world where there is no racism, there is no gender. It's a new world. Go away, governments. We're free here, and it's like that fantasy is part of what the problem is, and it's part of the attraction, obviously, of the internet. Because who wouldn't want to live in a world where we don't have to deal with a legacy problem? Yeah.
And do you think, so you say that the internet should resemble like local communities and should reflect that more. So are there companies, are there pockets of the internet that you think are doing that well or that you admire?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I think that obviously Wikipedia is something I wrote a lot about, and I feel Wikipedia, part of what we talk about the problem with Silicon Valley, I think, is also the scalability idea that everything has to scale. And once you scale, like once Facebook has 2 billion users and Google has more than 1 billion, you can't have a human touch. So I think of Wikipedia, it has bots and it does automate a lot of things, but it fundamentally is still aspiring to be human scale. People definitely dissect about the problems with Wikipedia, and there's this appearance of no hierarchy, but there obviously are people who are administrators and there are clicks and all that kind of stuff. I don't mean to minimize that, but fundamentally those are human problems. So I look at something like Wikipedia and admire that it still aspires to be a human scale project. I think that is like a minimum requirement for any any kind of internet project has to have that human scale, not the digital billion user scale. And we were kind of talking about Tim Berners-Lee before, and in this sense, this is kind of what I think Berners-Lee was sort of talking about. Early on, he wanted this editing tool with the browser, right? It was a big issue about whether that first browser that he made versus the one that Mosaic, the famous one Mark Andreessen made, that became Netscape and became the progenitor of all this, would have an editing tool. And for Berners-Lee, why was an editing tool so important? It just was like a metaphor or a way of making sure that people could feel that the internet wasn't passive, that the web wasn't passive, that you were part of it. And like, I think that is just so vital. I don't know how to describe that, because obviously you could say that Twitter and Facebook and Google are all about giving people voice. So I totally get that, but it's more the sense of ownership of it and creation of that it's done in your sphere, not in a company sphere. So I just think that is that's what I talk about with localness. And I think that, I was talking, it's really interesting. I was on a program, a radio show in New York, and a colleague who used to be from the Times was writing about local newspapers and was talking about how local newspapers we know are kind of dying, and that part of it is advertising, even local advertising, through Facebook and Google can be so targeted, and it's like they found a way to reach. You want to reach Bayside, Queens. They found a way to reach Bayside, Queens in a way that doesn't involve being in Bayside, Queens, or the way Bayside, Queens is organized. It's just sort of through other triggers. And that's kind of the problem. So it's solving a lot of the problems, getting local ads and reaching localities, but it's not doing it through a structure that's useful, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's not just the mere localness or the mere individuality, but like part of a structure, a society, where we're all aware of each other. So
do you think people become less civic-minded when you sort of take that community aspect?
I think that's really, maybe you've seen on Twitter, there's been people have been putting this graphic out a lot of the rise of polarization in politics and mapping that with the rise of social networks. And, it's this sense, I was talking with a friend about this, that like when advertisements are so targeted and can be targeted and not everyone sees them, and you can have that very, I guess what people call the filter bubble. I don't want to act like I'm coming up with new insights here. These are kind of problems that people saw all along. I guess what I wanted to do, rather than just criticize, was sort of like explain in a very understanding way how we got here. Like how did well intentions end up in this wrong path? And so to me, it's like a different interview I had. It was asking me kind of about these mottos, like "Don't be evil," whatever you want to call whatever that was at Google, or "Move fast and break things." And it's like, I don't think these are cynical like tricks that these companies are playing. I mean, I think they show where it started from, and it's almost like it's such a powerful tool. These social networks are so massive and so strong that if we don't, it's almost like you need outside advice, and we as a society have to grapple with it. Something I've talked about a bunch was, because for some of these appearances, was looking at the hearings about the Russian influence on the election. I was struck there was a scene where Senator Al Franken was asking the general counsel for Facebook about whether he could just pledge not to take political ads that were paid for in rubles. Right? So he was like sort of almost like doing it as a joke. And the counsel said, "That's a very good signal. We're really mindful of that. Thank you for pointing that out." He was like, "No, can you just say that you will not accept political ads paid in rubles?" And he just would not commit to it. And like Al Franken got very frustrated and kind of yelled at him even. And I was sitting there thinking, why would he not agree to that? It's such a straightforward kind of pledge. But I think fundamentally it spoke to Facebook saying, you, Al Franken, are not telling us how we're going to do our algorithm. That's for us to figure out. It's a good point you make. It's an important signal. We're going to factor it in, and we'll get back to you on it. And I think that arrogance is really why the book's called The Know-It-Alls, is what has to end. Like we have to, as a society, have to answer these questions. It can't be that a handful of leaders of these companies are going to, with all good intentions, are going to come up with the answer. I've always had this motto of, maybe it's a little too self-deprecating, but the wise man knows he knows nothing. I mean, the truly wise person, the true know-it-all, will know that they need help. And I hope that's kind of where we're going. But yeah.
That's the Socrates model.
Yes, exactly.
So changing gears a little bit.
Sure.
So throughout the book, you seem to have this resistance to quantification. So whether it be measuring intelligence with IQ, or measuring the impact of education with different number metrics. It seems to you not only to be reductionist, but also to be even harmful in some cases. And it seems in today's world, it's a common desire to want to be data-driven and to optimize around data. It seems like you're sort of a contrarian and pushing back on that. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's such a great question. I think that is like one of the real, and this relates to journalism too. You'll see these debates about data-driven journalism, and yeah, I guess I'm always going to think a better story is being more effective than data, and I guess I am suspicious of this kind of reducing such ineffable qualities like intelligence to a number. And I do bring it back to that history in the book of AI, because I think fundamentally, if you think a computer can be a thinking being, it's like you're basically saying to be a thinking being is just to have a head, like just have the circuits in your brain. And I think we recognize that it's a very odd image to think of just a brain being all that is important. I mean, I think about even my own personal life, it's like something my wife and I talk about, like the mind-body divide, and the idea that that there is more to life than just the mind. And I bring it up because it's like it's that seeing intelligence only even what your brain does and not seeing how you function in the world is a real mistake. And I feel I think of it like it's ruthlessly efficient. I think we were just talking about how like it reminds me of kind of even the people who take over companies and sort of see their value if you break it up and sell this part off and don't see the whole of a company or the whole of a society. You could argue that arguably, look at what Facebook does, where they basically break our population up into 14 categories, and it's just pernicious because it's sort of it's not seeing a whole. Now that's not necessarily about. I guess that is data driven. When they're breaking up 14 categories, they're using data and analytics to come up with those numbers. I just think it's a mistake. I guess it fundamentally puts me though not on the side of efficiency. And I think about obviously I have friends, especially at the paper, the New York Times, who really believed in data-driven journalism. And I remember like having a very good friend, a very smart friend, who explained to me that like the whole idea of being hot in basketball, like being on a tear, where it is just erratic, is not true. And I was like, it can't not be true. I've just seen people, and then he'll break down the stats and show you that it isn't. And so I don't want to like sit there and cling to things that are just fundamentally not true. Mm-hmm. But that said, I do think there are these sort of inexpressible qualities. And I don't know that I just don't know that efficiency is the most important thing. I think there are other things that get lost. I'll make one last point on that. Maybe it brings it back to sort of the, my haranguing tone, but it's like, if you focus on efficiency in this kind of, what am I saying about when you break up companies or something? You're extracting the most value out of this thing you have by breaking it up, but you are not looking at the costs. It's very easy to just sort of dismiss the costs of doing that. And I think that when you just put a number on intelligence, you can find yourself lacking. It isn't, whatever your goal was, to hire the best people for your company to solve a problem, it won't necessarily lead to the best results, because I don't think you fully, again, the wise man knows he knows nothing. I mean, that you aren't going to be able to create a number way to judge intelligence in a way that is useful for whatever project you have in mind, I would say. So that's why I'm skeptical. But I do know the power of this, and I think part of what writing this book is sort of dealing with the fact that these companies are so successful. I'd say the biggest pushback I get from people when I talk about it is this idea that, people love these companies, so what are you talking about? Like, you're basically telling people they don't know what's in their own interest. So, mm-hmm. Yeah.
So at the end of the book, where do we go from here? Yes. You say that to rely on the companies themselves to sort of change the course would be like blasphemous or something like that. So why is that the case?
It's kind of what we were talking about, where it's the humility that it's kind of we need us as a society to come together and kind of come up with some rules of how we're going to live together with these companies, and and things are moving so fast that it's almost like we need to slow down and talk about it together. I was struck that, again, looking at that hearing, that there is a kind of consensus that on the Republicans and Democrats. The sharpest questioner, I thought, at that hearing was the Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, who was asking a lot of hard questions and being very suspicious about all the data collection. And so I think that, I do think we, going forward, like we need to empower people. We need to maybe lessen the power of the companies. I was thinking, I sort of talk a lot about regulation and like the European style of regulation, European values, and maybe say that, the right to be forgotten is maybe a violation of free speech or however you want to view it, but that it's a very important value. So I lean a lot on regulation stuff, and I can see why people resist that. And talking to a friend, I think another way to think of it is also, why not empower people to get more control of their data? I saw the Times today had a piece about there should be taxation on data collection, and I would more say that, like, I was looking back when I was reading about McCarthy and Weizenbaum that in the 70s, Nixon set up a commission about privacy. I guess there were people really concerned about medical records, and they're asking, what should we do with this new thing, computerized collection of data? And they suggested that corporations and the government should have to report what they have on you. And it ended up that we only said about the government, not for corporations. This is before that. Obviously, I'm not blaming this on Google or Facebook or anything. It was way before there were big companies, but I guess IBM, there were people like Data. So I think that might be a step forward. That's a way, rather than viewing it as the government, maybe that's a way. I've been talking to people about like the power of narrative. So maybe that's a better narrative. Instead of the narrative being government should come down and stop these companies from doing what they're doing great, no, maybe we should empower people in a libertarian way almost, to sort of say, you control your data, and then give you more, and that might be a way of sort of slowing the brakes on a lot of this stuff and kind of getting people like to not participate in the system that is causing damage. So I'm thinking of new ideas, but I do feel like it's a very tough question. What am I saying? And I didn't want this book to be only a screed. I really wanted it to be a look at how we got here and a look at, I guess in some ways, these unappreciated people and events, computer science and Stanford and the pull of libertarian ideas and why they make sense to a certain group of people and why that is so attractive, but maybe isn't, and might make sense in a computer lab, but not make sense in our whole country. So same thing. So I think that is where I would go. I would go like, making things smaller and giving people more power over their data. But it's something for us all to talk about, I guess, is what I'm hoping it'll lead to a dialogue. So
I think that's a great note to end on. So I think we can take some audience questions.
Are there? Maybe a little.
Jesse.
Oh, here.
You talked a lot about the data issue, owning your own data. That seems like it's kind of at the forefront of just the public conversation right now. If you had to kind of make a prediction, do you think any of the stuff that's kind of being proposed legislatively to curb maybe the monopolies that Google and Facebook have will actually take into effect?
Yeah, if I had to make a prediction, I would be kind of leery about it, actually. I do think, because I think you have to, that much change will happen, because I think part of what people believe is this, at least there are companies, right? I was talking with some person from like a panel that, imagine if it was like a Chinese company that was the Facebook of America, then how would we feel? So I think in that sense, it's almost like, especially under this current president, with this very populist nationalist view, there's probably a real comfort, at least, in having these big companies be American companies. So I wonder what's going to happen. I think it's really fascinating. I do think the election meddling has been a watershed. It's sort of shifted the public consciousness, because prior to something as significant as that, this idea that maybe our democracy was tampered with, and obviously it was tampered with in many ways, but this was one outlet, and maybe it was done kind of without people running these companies noticing. That kind of woke up people and gives it a much greater gravity. Like I'm saying, these other kind of concerns become much more trivial about what these social networks are doing. Now, I think it has woken everyone up. I genuinely just don't know how it's all going to shake out, because I think there are polls in all different ways. I mean, it's going to be amazing to watch. And I do think, who even knows what's going to happen in our country? If there's a wave election of maybe Democrats sort of bounce back, that could change things, especially a populist Democrat might have a very different view in all this than a populist Republican. So it's a great question, something like I'm going to be watching very carefully for sure.
One more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
I guess you could read your book and then become kind of just a hardline kind of Luddite. What do you think is kind of, what's the conclusion that's actionable after reading your book in terms of solving some of the problems you outlined that might involve going with the grain of history or kind of working with?
I definitely not want to come off as a Luddite, and I definitely believe these tools are amazing. So I do think it becomes sort of, I guess why McCarthy was such an interesting figure to me, because that and this is something that maybe Dave and I were going to talk about, is this idea that this research was done under government auspices. I mean, there was a really interesting sort of story that McCarthy, I didn't get this in the book, and you can't even believe this is even true, that McCarthy, like in the 70s, had this idea that back in that day, there was all this, India had a kind of hostile relations with the US, so there was all this money that they owed the US that they only would give back in rupees, right? And he had this idea that you should digitize the Library of Congress by having people in India enter it in. And like, he was thinking about this in the 70s. And so it's like, but he was thinking about it not like I should do it so I could have a company could own this, but he was thinking about like the government should do it. So I'm like very much in favor of research innovation, and like I don't want to be perceived as a Luddite, but I think maybe he's having more of this being done under a government auspices and being thought of as helping all of society and kind of respecting people's privacy and data would be a great step forward. So I definitely was very worried that this book could be perceived that way, and I really struggle. And I guess that's why I also wanted to talk so much about Wikipedia, because I see it as such a example of that, of technology being used to really help people understand the world and without many of the downsides that I'm talking about. So.
What about, like, for instance, at Google, we have, it's called 20% time, where you can pursue your own projects. So do you think there's an opportunity there for people to maybe pursue maybe more local projects?
I do. I think you were saying that. I think that, like, I mean, it'd be really interesting to see how you could create projects that would forge these local community bonds. I did write an article for the Times about Red Hook in Brooklyn, which is a very isolated neighborhood in Brooklyn. And kind of it's a poor neighborhood. It's kind of becoming gentrified, and they were trying to create a mesh network out there, and the way that like they could use that local internet to sort of inform people about their community, and so I do think I don't work at Google. That would be like, it would be amazing to see what the minds here would come up with to sort of really because what I was saying was community. It's not just being able to target a community through data points, but like building the connections of community. I know that Mark Zuckerberg talks about this a lot with Facebook too, but I mean, you have to do this in a real, genuine, offline way. And somehow, I think they're really, I've seen that being tried in Red Hook, where they are trying to use the young people to get them to use the Wi-Fi, and maybe when they access the Wi-Fi, they kind of see things about their neighborhood, and events are sort of, offline events are sort of promoted that way or something. So it would be amazing to see what could be done. But I think those are the kind of central questions about keeping it local, creating stronger bonds. So that would be amazing to see what the 20% time would lead to. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right, no further questions? That's great. All right, thank you, David.
Yeah. Thank you,
Sean.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Sure, thank you.